talk about is some of the work that my team has been doing on building chatbots. So Intuit, as you know, is the sponsor of this conference. We're a company that's located, the head office is in California in the United States. And what we do, our mission is to power prosperity around the world. And we do that by building software that helps our customers make their financial lives a lot easier. So imagine that you're a small business owner and you need to keep track of your income, you need to keep track of your expenses, maybe your inventory. Our product QuickBooks helps you with that. And for anyone who's ever lived in Canada or the United States, you know that in April, it's a stressful time of year because you have to file your income taxes, and it's not easy. And our product TurboTax helps people file their income taxes. Mint is our another product we have that allows you to it's basically an aggregator. So you include all of the information that you have about your different financial accounts, and it aggregates all of your information so you get sort of a global picture of your financial health all in one place. So when our customers use our products, they kind of have two different options if they have questions. So the first option is what we call self-help, where they can go and they can do a search within our FAQs. They can do a search within our question and answer forum or the articles that our experts have written. And that's a great option in that it doesn't take them away very long from what they're doing. It's a quick response time. But the results usually are not very personalized because the answers that are in those articles are quite general. They're meant to be sort of an answer for many different people. If they need something more personalized, they have the option of calling one of our customer care agents. But the problem with that is that it takes them away from what they're doing. They have to go through the IVR system. They have to potentially wait for an agent to be available. And so what we decided to do was to give a third option, and that was to build a chatbot. It has the advantage of being very quick. There's no agent involved. There are no humans involved. So you don't have to wait for someone to be available. And then it's also personalized. It's a conversation, if you like, between you, the customer, and the computer. And so you can ask personalized questions. And so this example here, how do I share my info with my accountant, gave the results here in that box. And while this example isn't a super personalized one, because the question wasn't very personalized, you can also ask things like show my bank balance, which then is, of course, very personalized to your particular situation. But before we go any farther, I want to talk about some of the terminology that we use when we talk about chatbots. The first is the utterance, and that's what our customers type in. It's what the customer says. It's in their own words. It's basically the question that they're asking. That's what the utterance is. And then the intent is kind of the generic meaning of what the customer has been asking. So it's really the goal, what they're trying to do, but it's kind of a generic way of describing what that is. And then once we identify what the goal is that the customer is trying to do, the chatbot gives a response. And so those are the three pieces that I want you to keep in mind as we're going through this talk. So in our example, how do I share my info with my accountant is the utterance. That's what I, the customer, typed in. The response is given here. That's what the chatbot has responded with. But what you don't see, what the customer doesn't see, is the intent, the underlying goal, or the sort of generic representation of what the customer is trying to do. And speaking of what's going on behind the scenes, so as I said, the customer types in the utterance, and then sees the response that the chatbot has given them. But what's going on in the background is there are actually three different modules. And the first one is the natural language understanding module. And that's the piece that has to take what the customer has said, whatever words the customer has used, and then translate that and match it into what the customer is intending to do, to that customer intent. And then the intent gets fed into the dialogue management system, which keeps track of where you are in the conversation, what you've already been talking about. It now has the information about the intent that it then passes on to the response generation module, which then is the piece that actually comes up with what the response will be that the chatbot sends back to the customer. And underlying all of that is a knowledge base. And that could have information in it about the customer. It could have information in it about tax laws, whatever information that will help all of these modules do the best job they can for the customer. So what we're going to focus on today is the natural language understanding piece of the chatbot. And that's a really important piece because it's the piece that has to interpret what the customer says. And the customer can type in anything. And so we have to do our best with the natural language understanding model to really understand what the customer has said and map what they say to the intent. And so here's an example. The share with pro or share with a tax professional is the intent. But these are some examples of the different ways that the customer could say, I need to share my information with my accountant. So they could say, send info to accountant. They could say, I need to share my information with my bookkeeper. Or tax preparer needs access to account details. And so you can see that they don't have very many words that overlap, and the way that they've phrased the questions are very different, but they really all need to map, the natural language understanding engine needs to be able to map all of those into this one intent. So how does it do it? Well, it's a supervised model. And so as we all know with supervised models, the model type is important, but what's really important is the training data that you give to the model, because that's what the model can use then to try and extrapolate from data that it then hasn't seen. And so for an NLU engine, the training data that you need looks like this. You have the utterance on one side, and then you have the intent on the other. And so the more data you have, the better. The higher quality data you have, the better. And by high quality in this case, I mean you want to have data that is in the customer's words. So for example, suppose you're a designer of a chatbot and you think, okay, my chatbot can do all of these different things, but I want it to do something new, something that it hasn't been trained to do yet. And so I need to come up with training data so that the natural language understanding engine can understand when the customer says something that matches to my intent. And so the first thing I can do is I can say, well, I'll just come up with some ways that I think the customer will ask for this intent. And that's great, but it doesn't scale very well. And it's also my words, not our customer's words. And if I'm a domain expert, I work in the financial software industry, the words I use may be quite different from what the words our customers would use. So ideally, we want customer words. And we have a number of sources of customer words. With some of our products, especially some of our global products, we actually offer chat with live agents. And so we can see when customers are chatting with live agents, how they phrase their questions. And then also when they do self-help searches. So when they're on our FAQ page or they're doing asking questions in the question and answer forum, we can also look and see how they phrase their questions there. And then as our chatbot has a longer life, it matures, the customer doesn't know what it knows how to answer, and so the customers will ask anything. And so we can go through the history of what the customers have asked to also get information about how the customer phrases certain questions. Okay, so now we have a huge pile of customer words, but how do we know which of those phrases matches to the intent that I'm trying to build out as the designer? And so to help the designer with this problem, we built something called an utterance generation tool. And the goal behind the utterance generation tool is it allows the designer to enter a phrase that they think is representative of the intent that they're trying to build. And then it goes through our huge pile of customer words and finds the phrases that are the closest in meaning to the phrase that the agent or the designer, has actually entered. And it tries to get the phrases to be close in meaning. So not just in words. In this example, you see it does share a lot of the same words, but it also doesn't have to. It just has to have very similar meaning. And the way we measure meaning is we have actually a distance metric. And we say if two phrases are close to each other, then they have similar meaning. So now the question is, how do we get this distance metric? Well, it all starts with words. And probably many of you are familiar with word embeddings, but just in case you're not, the idea is to take a word and translate it into a numerical representation. So usually it's a vector, often 300 numbers in length. And the goal is if two words have similar meaning, their embeddings, their vector representations will be mathematically close to each other. And these embeddings, so there are two reasonably popular embeddings that are available publicly. So Word2Vec from Google and Glove from Stanford. And the way they work is they get fed in a lot of text, just a huge amount of text. And they infer from where certain words appear in the text what their meaning might be. So for example, if the word babies is very, very often appears in the same sentence as parents, mother, father, then they see also that the word infant appears in the same kinds of sentences with the words like mother and father and parents. Then they can sort of infer that the word babies and the word infants have similar meaning. And so we start with something like these publicly available word embeddings, and then we train them a little bit further. We fine-tune them on our data so that they can understand sort of more financial meanings behind words. So for example, if somebody is working on their tax return when they're using TurboTax and they use the word return, most likely they're talking about their tax return as opposed to returning an item that they purchased online and they need to send back. Okay, so we start with the word embeddings, and now we can understand when words have similar meaning because we can look to see if their word embeddings have similar, or sorry, are mathematically close to each other. But the question is, we don't want to just match words, we want to actually match phrases. And so how do we determine when two phrases have similar meaning? Well, one of the ways you can do it is look at all of the individual word vectors for each of the words in the phrase and combine them in some way. You could do a straight average, you could do other things to get a single vector for a phrase and then compare the distance between the vectors for phrases. But that's not actually what we do. We use something called the word mover's distance. And the idea behind the word mover's distance is you start with one phrase. So it might be the phrase that the designer has entered as being representative for the intent. And so here our representative phrase is send information to my accountant. And you get rid of the stop words. So to and my are not full of meaning in this phrase. And so you're just left with the words send information and accountant. And then you take your candidate phrase. So the phrase that you're wondering, is it close to this other phrase that I care about? And you look again at the words without the stop words in that candidate phrase. And you start with the first one, share. And you look at the word embedding for share, and you compare it to the word embeddings for all the other words that you have in the representative phrase. And you find out which one's the closest. Well, it turns out that send and share, in my little example here, happen to be the closest. So then you go on to the next word, bookkeeper. And you do it again. You check and see how far bookkeeper is from all the words in the representative phrase. And you see this time it's closest to the word accountant, and so you pair those two. And then you do the same thing with info and information. And so then you define the word mover's distance as being the distance, you sum the distances between these pairs of words, and that's the distance then between the phrase. And so it doesn't matter what order the words are in. They can be in any order, bookkeeper matched with accountant, but bookkeeper was the second word over here and the third word over there. So it helps you, get away from being sort of very strict about the order of the words, and it allows you to pair words based on meaning, no matter where they exist in the sentence. Okay, so you're probably thinking to yourself, great, Diane, this is an easy example. You've got 3 words on one side, 3 on the other. What happens if you add a 4th word to one of the sentences, or now you've got a mismatch between them? And this is where things get a little bit more complicated because you can't do one-to-one matching anymore. And so now we get the fun of looking at the math that underlies the word mover's distance. So for those of you who aren't interested in the math, feel free to take a little nap and I'll let you know when to wake up. But for those of us who are interested, let's get going. So we look at the number of words that we care about, the number of words in our vocabulary, and then we say that n is the total number of words that we care about in our vocabulary. And then we look at the phrases, and we just label them, phrase 1, phrase 2, phrase 3, so on. So the P sub k refers to the kth phrase in our list of potential phrases. And then we start doing counts. We count the number of times each word in the vocabulary appears in each phrase. And so C sub ik is the number of times that word I appears in phrase K. So it's just simple counts. And then all we do is we normalize them. So we look at the total number of words in phrase K, and we take the count divided by that total number of words. And that gives us sort of a sense of how important or how much weight that word has within that phrase, but just based on count, not based on meaning at all. Okay, so for our example, our vocabulary was consisted of these words. So N is 7. Our first phrase is send information to my accountant. The second phrase is share with my bookkeeper my accounting information. And so then you can just do the counts. And so you can see here that the word accountant appears in the first phrase. The word accounting does not, so it gets a 0, and so on. And then, so those are the CIKs, are just the counts. And then the YIKs are just those counts divided by the number of words in the phrase. So we do that for the first phrase. We do it for the second phrase. And then we define d, lowercase d, of ij to be the Euclidean distance between the word embeddings of word I and word j. So you just take those 300-dimensional vectors, or however long your vectors are, and you just compute the Euclidean distance, and that's the distance then between the two words. Now here come the important variables, the TIJs. These are the variables that you're trying to figure out. And they are think of it as the fraction of word I in the first phrase that's mapped to word J in the second. So with my first example, we had 1-to-1 mapping, and so things were easy. With the second example, we had 3 words on one side, 4 on the other. We knew we couldn't do 1-to-1 mappings anymore. And so this is where you start getting into your fractional mapping, or fractional pairs. Fractional pairings. And then the word mover's distance is just defined as this capital D that we compute by solving the following linear program. And I have to say, I studied operations research in grad school and have not done a lot of linear programming since then, so I was so excited. This is actually my favorite slide. Here it comes, the linear program. So what we're trying to do is find the TIJs, they have to be positive, or at least non-negative, that solve the following linear program. They minimize this sum, and the sum is the weight of the weight of the mapping of the fraction of word I in the first phrase to word J in the second phrase, multiplied by the distance between those two words. And obviously, if we didn't have our constraints, the minimum would just be set all the TIJs to 0, but that wouldn't help us at all. So we have constraints, and the constraints are pretty simple. Think of them as sort of conservation of flow or conservation of mass types of constraints. And so there's a word, say, if we look at word I in the first phrase, in phrase K, and we know how much weight it had in that phrase. That was the Y sub IK. And the total fraction of that word that gets mapped to other words in the other phrase has to equal, the sum of those weights has to equal the weight of that word within the first phrase. So we go back to our YIKs, and the sum over all the J's, what it could be mapped to, has to equal that weight of that word within the first phrase. And then similarly, on the other side, anything that gets mapped to a word in the second phrase has to equal, all the weights have to sum to equal the weight of that word within the second phrase. So for example, the word J in the second phrase, phrase L, is going to equal the sum over the I's of the TIJs. So I'll show you an example, and hopefully it'll become a little bit more clear. So here's our example again. We've got 7 words in our vocabulary. We've got our Y1s and our Y2s. And then we've got all the words in the vocabulary on each side. And so if we start simple, we just think, okay, well, the word accountant could potentially get mapped to all of these words on the right-hand side. And then we do that for all of the words, and you can see that we end up with n squared TIJs. But wait, you say, I know that some of those words don't even appear in the first phrase. Some of these words on this side don't even appear in the second phrase. So why are we thinking about them at all? And you're absolutely right. The only way, but sort of mathematically speaking, I mean, that's the logic behind it, but mathematically speaking, remember that we had those constraints where all the weights, all of these arrows, the TIJs had to sum to be equal to this value here. They're all non-negative, so the only way they can sum to 0 is if they're all actually 0. So we can simplify it, and we only have to worry about the weights between words that actually appear in the sentences, which matches our intuition. So I actually ran it. the code for word movers distance is available in the Python package gensim if you're interested in trying it out. And this is the result that I got. And what it ended up doing was it said that I'm going to take the word share and I'm going to map it entirely to the word send. So I get 1/4. Basically, everything I have over here is going to get mapped to send. Everything I have with info is going to get mapped to information. Everything with bookkeeper is going to get mapped to accountant. And then I've got that darn word left over, and it just gets the excess. Turns out that happened to be the optimal solution in this case. Okay, so then once you've got these TIJs, you've solved that linear program, then the word mover's distance was the sum of the TIJs multiplied by the distance between the words. So you just take 1/12 times the distance between accountant and accounting, and then 1/4 times the distance between accountant and bookkeeper, and so on. You add those all up, you get your distance between the two phrases. And so that's how we get our distances here in our utterance generation tool. And so again, the designer enters the phrase, we search through, we actually do the word mover's distance, we compute it for each of the candidate phrases, and we find the ones that are the closest. We give the designer a long list, they can filter if they want, and then they can take those and actually populate the training data with all of this extra data that's actually in our customers' words. So these are the way that the customers have phrased these questions. Okay, and did it work? Well, I actually typed these in, send information to my accountant, share my info with my bookkeeper. I got the same result, so it looks like it works, even though I'm using different words, different phrases. But what happens when there's an utterance, so something that the customer types in, that the chatbot can't understand? For whatever reason, the NLU it's so different from what it was trained on, it doesn't really understand what the customer means. In that case, what we do is, what it used to be, we would just say, sorry, I didn't understand you. Then we thought, well, we could do better than that. We can at least go search, as if the customer had done a search in our self-help area, and just use that same phrase, and then show the different articles that came out from searching. But even that we weren't satisfied with. People were using the chatbot because they were looking for something a bit more than just search. So we thought, well, maybe we can do something better. And so what we did was we thought about what the NLU engine was trying to do. Okay, so the NLU engine takes the utterance and it tries to map it to an intent. And it does the best job it can based on the training data it had. But what if, and so it comes out with sort of a certain confidence that it thinks it matches to each one. And what if none of the confidences were high enough? It felt like it didn't get a good answer. So it would just go off and do the search like I showed. But we thought, well, maybe we can do a little bit better. Maybe we can take what the customer has entered and see if it's close in meaning to any of the utterances that we have in our training data. And so while that utterance in the training data may not have been enough to help the NLU engine understand this new phrase, maybe we can at least see if there's anything that's close and just ask the customer, is this what you meant? And so what we do is we use the same kind of word mover's distance. So we start with word embeddings. We compute the word mover's distance between this new phrase that the customer just entered that the NLU engine didn't understand, and all of the utterances in our training data set. And we find the ones that are the closest, the ones that are, I guess, the closest but have different intents, because we're not sure that we've got the right answer for the customer. And so all we do this comparison, we find the top ones that seem to match, and we just ask the customer, I didn't quite understand what you said. Did you mean? And then it gives them a list of possible things. And then the customer can go through and say, yeah, actually, one of these is what I meant. Or if it wasn't, they can then, just type something else. But the advantage of this is it gets them a little bit closer to the answer they're looking for if we did find something that was relevant, something that was close. But that also helps us, because now we have another piece of training data. We've got that phrase that the customer said, how do I send my file to my tax preparer? And we know now that it maps to the same intent as whatever the customer selected. In this case, how do I share with my accountant? So I can add that to my list of training data. I've got the utterance, and I can add the share with pro intent, because that was the intent that matched the utterance that the customer actually chose. Okay, so wrapping up. What we're trying to do is build a chatbot that understands what our customer says And the NLU engine, the natural language understanding engine, is the part of the chatbot that does that piece. And we can build a better NLU engine by giving it better quality data. And we get the data, better quality data from two different sources. One is looking at our huge history of what our customers have already asked us and finding the ones that are close to the intent that we're trying to build out. Or when the customer enters something that the chatbot didn't understand, we actually get the customer labeled data for us. And with both of those, we're finding nearby phrases. That's the key to both of them, is understanding when phrases are near to each other in meaning. And we do that with the word embeddings to start with, and then using those word embeddings with the word movers distance. That's it. Thank you very much.